Well, good morning. Good to see you. Several months ago, Roseanne and I woke up one morning. It was around 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and we're stumbling around the coffee maker, and we look, and the back door to the house is wide open. And some of us, you've had moments like that, and anxiety begins to increase. So we walk over to the back door, and we realize there's some chairs that are sort of moved out of the way, and there's sort of that panic that begins to set in. And I'm wondering, what in the world am I going to do if somebody's broken in? Like, give them the windmill, here I come. But got to protect the family, So it's one of those moments, and we start to wonder, has someone broken into the house? Are they in the house? Those moments. And we walk outside, and there's some things that are just sort of out of place. And we begin to hear a noise, and there's our backyard. Then there's sort of this alleyway where the trash cans are, and there's a fence. And over on this side of the house, where we can't see from our backyard, I begin to hear a noise, and I begin to wonder, what in the world is going on? And so we walk over towards it. We're not quite sure what to do. Do you call 911? Who in the world is trying to break into our house? And I peer my head around the corner to see what is going on. And to my relief and surprise, nobody is trying to break into the house. But our two oldest boys are trying to break out of the house at 6 o'clock in the morning. 5 and 3 years old, in their pajamas. They have the gate open, which is quite heavy, by the way, and they're dragging their bikes through the gate. Just going for a little morning joyride. And I hear our 5-year-old, he's saying to our 3-year-old in this particular moment, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, like a trained bank robber in this moment. And they're getting the bikes, and it's just one of those moments. When I think about security, I think about who to keep out of the house. I don't think about who to keep in. Now, when people come to the house and they say, hey, we'd like to sell you a security system, you have people that ring your door and doorbell, and they ask you that question. I always say, do you have anything that can keep people in, like some barbed wire? I'll try. So that's what we did. We bought some barbed wire and put it up, and some electric fencing, and it's worked great. Don't judge me. A bunch of Pharisees today, man. But the reason I say that is because we live in a world of increased security. Security is increasing everywhere. It might be cyber security. When you think of the word security, you think of cyber security. It was a few years ago, you just had a flip phone, and you didn't need your thumb to access it. You didn't need a passcode. Now there's facial recognition. Airport security is another. Some of us, you remember the days where you could get to the airport 30 minutes before your flight left. Not the world that we live in anymore. Home security. Security has just increased everywhere. And if you're in the security business or at your particular job, you have to think about security on a regular basis. The job of security is to make something increasingly difficult for somebody to do something. That's the job of security. It's to make something difficult for somebody to gain access to something. It's just, that's the role of security. It's to increase difficulty for somebody to do something. I say that because we're in the middle of this series called ZOE. In fact, let me hear you say the word ZOE. And it just means life. And we've looked throughout the course of this series at how Jesus has said, this is how you have life, this quality to life, not just breathing, not just existing. And he's going to make this odd statement that we're going to look at together this morning where he says, I am the gate, which is a bizarre thing to say about life. I am the gate. He's essentially declaring in this moment, I am security for God. If you want to gain access to God, if you want to be in the presence of the divine, if you want to be in the presence of God, you have to go through me. I am access to God. What a bizarre thing to say. Last week we talked about I am the light, and I see how that leads to life. The week before, I am the bread. I see how that leads to life, but I am the gate. What in the world? How is that a life-giving image for what God has come to do? And I think it raises all sorts of questions. What kind of a gate is he? Is he a gate with barbed wire on it? That's just trying to keep people in the church sort of safe and away from culture? Is he one of those gates like when you go to Disneyland and you have to pay to get in? Often church feels like that, doesn't it? What kind of a gate exactly has he come into this world to be? And so if you have a Bible, turn with me to John chapter 10 is where we're going to be. And if you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens or you can download the CRB app, and that's a great place to follow along as well. John chapter 10, we're going to start in verse 1 together. How are we doing this morning? 4 of you, fantastic. What's wrong with you people? Hey, I'm doing great this morning. My mom is in town, for real. Like, my mom's here. My mom's right over here. Mom, can you just kind of wave at people? There she is. Yeah, that's good. Don't mess with me this morning. I have mom power on my side, all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. So it's good to have mom in town. John chapter 10, starting in verse 1, is where we are going to be. And Jesus is describing how he has come to bring life as a gate. And one of the things you see quite often in the book of John is people are confused and when Jesus is speaking, and this is the same when he gives this image. John chapter 10, verse 1, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees." So that's the audience for the story, the Pharisees, the religious elite, the power brokers of the day. "Anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber." And Jesus is saying this because in the story, the Pharisees, the religious elite, are the thieves and the robbers. "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep." So at this point, you've got some sheep, you got some shepherds, or a shepherd. "The gatekeeper," so now you got a gatekeeper, "opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out." This is the role of the shepherd. "When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger." The sheep will never follow a stranger, which is, he's not making this up. This is actually true. If you've been around sheep, you know this is sort of the way sheep operate. They only listen to the voice they're trained to hear, the voice of the shepherd. In fact, if you try to call a sheep, I don't know if you've tried this lately. In fact, we're all going to do a field trip to Ramona later today. And oh, come on, what's a sermon without a Ramona joke? If you call a sheep, but it's not used to your voice or it's never heard your voice, the sheep will actually have like a panic attack, and it won't eat for several days. It'll sort of break down because it's only used to hearing the voice of the shepherd. So there's some kind of a relationship that exists between the shepherd, which is next week, by the way, where Jesus says, "I am the shepherd." More to come on that. He brings out the sheep, and it says, in fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice if it's not the shepherd. Jesus uses this figure of speech, and I love this line, "But the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them," which happens over and over. You get the hint when you read John that Jesus is not a great communicator for some reason. Everybody seems to be scratching their head when he's trying to communicate information. Now, the Pharisees, they certainly, in the audience for the story, they certainly would sort of pick up on exactly what Jesus was talking about in terms of the scene that he's describing. This is a permanent sheep pen. This is true in Israel or Egypt or places in the Middle East to this very day. A village will have a permanent sheep enclosure because sheep are central to your economy. They produce wool, they produce clothing. So you'll have an alleyway with 8 or 9 houses that are small, about the size of a 1-car garage, and at the end of it is a sheep pen. And it will be a permanent structure. And there'll be a gatekeeper, typically a teenage boy that lives in the village. This happens to this very day. And the shepherd will come. It's a skilled position to lead the sheep out to eat grass in and around, because that's what sheep eat, in and around the village. And so the audience would certainly understand at this point, what Jesus is describing in terms of the sheep pen, but they're fuzzy on who is who in the story. Are we, they're essentially standing there, are we the sheep? Are you the shepherd? What's kind of he's kind of multiple choice. There's A, there's the sheep. B, there's the shepherd. C, there's the thieves and the robbers. Kind of which one are you? You got to kind of pick in the story. And then Jesus, after they're confused, says this, verse 7. Well, let me try to clear it up this way. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. Which, what in the world? That wasn't even one of the options. Sort of a bizarre thing. So what in the world is going on? He says, I am the gate for the sheep. Now, the context for this passage is John chapter 9, one chapter previous. And to sort of summarize that story, Jesus has healed a man that was born blind, and he heals him on the Sabbath. And there's a debate all throughout John 9. There's some triangulation between Jesus, the Pharisees, and the man that's healed as to whether or not this activity of what Jesus has done is from God or not. And the Pharisees are saying this can't be from God. They're the rule keepers, they're the law keepers, and they're essentially saying he broke the law. The old story says you can't heal or do work on the Sabbath, and they're essentially saying God would never break one of God's rules. So Jesus might be, the devil or somebody, some kind of faith worker, but it's not from God because God would never break the law. And so in this particular moment, and this is true all throughout the New Testament, the Pharisees, they have these 633 laws from the old story that they enforce, and they're essentially the gate. If you want to gain access to God, the Pharisees have described exactly how you do that. And they're essentially the ones in this particular moment that are the gate who say this is of God, this isn't of God, this gets in, this doesn't get in. And Jesus is essentially saying, I am the gate, because he's essentially saying to the Pharisees in this moment, you're not the gate. I'm the gate through which people enter into the activity in the presence of God. No longer do you find access to God through a system, you now find access to God through a person. I'm the gate. Now, a lot of things are sort of lost as we read this, but the audience would pick up on it because we don't live in a world where chances are pretty good you have not been around sheep lately. But in this audience and for this culture, they certainly would pick up on a lot of details. For starters, in Israel, 6 months out of the year, it's a rainy season from October all the way to March. It's very wet, sort of rainy conditions, which means that things grow when it's rainy. So in the village, if you have these sheep, essentially what you'll do is that the shepherd will lead them outside of the village on a daily basis for 6 months out of the year, and there's a continual food supply of grass because you have the rain, and so they can stay in the permanent structure inside the village. The other 6 months out of the year, it's not rainy. The other 6 months out of the year in Israel, not a good time to go. It's hot, it's dry, which means nothing's going to grow. So outside of the village, there is no grass for the sheep to eat. So and this happens to this very day, what a shepherd will do, and it's a highly skilled position, and because these sheep are central to your way of life and your economy, you have to lead the sheep out into the wilderness or into the wild to find grass to eat, because grass becomes more scarce the deeper into the summer months that you go, and the sheep need this to survive. And so they will leave home often for months at a time, and they'll wander in the wilderness with the shepherd looking for grass. And if you find grass, it's a good day. If you don't, well, you got some hungry sheep. So they'll stay out in the wilderness at night. And the question is, well, where do they sleep? And what the shepherd will do in the wilderness in the summer months is he will construct a sort of a makeshift sheep pen. And it's comprised of some sticks and some rocks. It might be some thorns to keep thieves, robbers, wolves out of your sheep pen. I brought in an image of what this will look like. Yeah, there you go. This is a sheep pen that's sort of a makeshift that a shepherd would construct in the wilderness for the sheep to live in. Do you notice something odd about this makeshift sheep pen? Yes, there's no gate, there's no door. And what the audience for the story would understand is that what a shepherd does, it's a common practice for shepherds, is they will actually sleep in the doorway, and they themselves become the gate. So when Jesus says, I'm the gate, it's a very literal sort of physical image. It's not some sort of metaphorical, oh, that's nice, sort of spiritual. No, in a literal sense, if the sheep want to come in, they have to go through the shepherd because he is literally the gate. Now, we don't live in a world with sheep, and we also don't live in a world anymore with Pharisees, although I could name a few. Just kidding. Sort of a Pharisee statement that I just made. We don't live in a world where we have sheep. We don't live in a world with Pharisees where, religious elite are going around enforcing law and throwing people in jail. It doesn't really work that way, especially in the United States of America. But I would argue we do live in a world where people find it difficult to access God. We do live in a world, for whatever particular reason, maybe because they met some Christians somewhere along the way they didn't like, maybe they had a bad church experience, whatever it was. But we do live in a world, and many of you have friends like this. They say things like, well, I like Jesus, but I don't like the church. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. For whatever reason, we live in a culture and in a world where there's not Pharisees, but it's certainly still difficult for people to find or to access God. I think every single person in this world, all 7 billion plus people on the planet today, and when you start having conversations with people who've never been to church in their life, you certainly begin to get this sense as well. Everybody's spiritual. Everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart, is the way one philosopher says it. Everybody has a spiritual urge or a spiritual desire inside of them. Something from a very early age inside all of us says there's more to life than you can taste, see, smell, touch, feel. There has to be more. The writer of Ecclesiastes says it this way, that eternity is set in the heart of all men, all mankind. Eternity is inside your heart. There's a longing for more. I think about Christmas and Easter where people show up to church and they don't any other time of the year. And the reason they do is because on those particular days, there's something about the God dial that's in every single one of our heart that just gets turned up and ramped up at Christmas and Easter, because we all have that longing to gain access to God. And many of us in this room, you could tell the story of how in your life you have found it difficult for whatever particular reason to gain access to God, even though there's that urge and desire to know the divine and to know God. For some of us, maybe you grew up in a family where you were taught at a very early age, if you want to know God, if you want to be one of the sheep, you need to wake up early and you need to read the Bible. You need to wake up early and you need to read the Bible. Some of us, you went to a church camp in 7th grade or 6th grade, and that was sort of your, I'm going to try this God thing. And you would have to wake up early and you would have to read the Bible. And you decided at a very early age, if that's what it means to be spiritual, and you hate waking up early and you hate reading the Bible, and there was this, if that's what it means to be spiritual, I'm not so sure I want to be one of the sheep. And the God dial just got turned off in your heart. Some of us, you grew up in a family, or maybe it was never taught to you, it was just sort of caught in the environment that you grew up in, that spiritual people are always emotional people. And some of us, when your grandmother would talk about Jesus, she would always cry. Or when you would go to church, or you would watch the TV preacher, he was always angry and sweaty. I'm not quite sure why, that's always the case, but it is. And at a very early age, you thought, if you have to be emotional, and you just thought about yourself, you thought, I haven't cried since Old Yeller in 7th grade, if that's what it means to be spiritual, I'm not so sure I can be one of the sheep, and the God dial just got turned off in your heart. Every single week, it seems like I meet somebody at CRB who comes and tells me about their upbringing. And for many of us in this room, you grew up in a church where it was through music, it was through worship music, and it was expressive, and it was charismatic, and it was energetic. And you remember going to church and everybody, and you just had your hands up, and that was just the way people expressed themselves. And at a very early age, or high school, somewhere along the way, you saw that, and you just thought, if that's what it means, and the God dial just got turned off in your heart. Some of us, you grew up in a church where it was stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. And there were things that were said. You didn't even understand it. And at a very early age, you had that urge to know God, but you thought, I don't even understand all that, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's all fine and good. But you just thought, if that's what it means to be spiritual, I'm not so sure I can be one of the sheep. And the God dial just got turned off in your heart because it seemed too difficult to get through the gate. I remember when I was around 18 years old and I became very interested in what it meant to be a follower of Christ, really for the first time. Just what does it mean to be a follower of Christ? And I remember well-intentioned Christians began to give me journals. And they would say, this is what it means to be a Christian. You have to journal. Does anyone else have this experience from childhood? And well-intentioned Christians, and I remember going to events at churches or hanging out with, I must have collected 10 to 15 journals that are on a shelf somewhere at my house to this very day of people saying, this is what it means. You got to journal. This is how you get to know God. And I hated to journal. I think I got a half page in, 18, 20 years ago. And there was just this sense, if that's what it means, I'm not so sure I can be one of the sheep, and the God dial just begins to be numbed and turned off. And typically what happens, well-intentioned Christians will teach you the practices of their faith as if it's the gate to faith. Some of us in this room, these are the spiritual scars that you carry. Well-intentioned Christians have taught you the gate is a practice of faith, things that are fine and good, journaling, worship, whatever it may be. And well-intentioned Christians will often teach you the practices of their faith as if it's the gate to faith, and it's not. Our faith certainly has a lot of practices attached to it, but our faith is not in those practices. Our faith is in a person named Jesus, and he comes along and says the gate is not a system. The gate is not a practice. The gate is a person. And whoever wants to come to God and gain entrance to God, because that God dial is in your heart just like it's in my heart, he says you have to come through a person named Jesus, not through a system. It's Jesus. And you say, well, what if I don't like to journal? Jesus says that's okay. It's not journaling that allows you to gain access to God. It's a wonderful practice. It's not singing that allows you to gain access to God. Jesus Christ comes and says, I'm the gate through which anybody who wants to come and gain access to God can gain access to God. The way one writer, Tully Tolovichin, I think is how you say his name, a pastor, he said it this way: Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. It's not Jesus plus 4 journal entries. It's not Jesus plus 8 songs, It's Jesus plus nothing equals everything. In fact, let's just say that together on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Don't put any locks on the gate. Don't put any barbed wire on this fence. It's Jesus plus nothing equals everything. It's actually that simple. It's not through a system or a practice. It's through a person that you gain access to God. This is so difficult as a church. This is so difficult as a pastor. There is a tendency in all of us to want to add some behaviors or add some rules or add some, church service or whatever it is and say, this is how you gain access to God. And all those things are fine and good. And this was a struggle in the early church. In the first church, all they had was a story of a resurrected Christ and witnesses to the resurrection. And they had a handful of books from the Old Testament, the old story, and some law and some rules that the Pharisees had sort of passed down and preserved. And they had those laws, those 633 rules, and they had this story of resurrection. There was this debate. What does it mean to follow God? What does it mean to be in the presence of God? What's the entry point? And for a lot of the early church, they said, well, it's Jesus plus, some of the rules or all of the rules that we've sort of been handed down. That's how you gain entrance to God. And Paul comes along, a writer of a lot of the New Testament, and he says, no. It's Jesus plus nothing equals everything. This is how Paul sort of settles this debate in Acts chapter 15, verse 19. I love this. He says, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles, who was everybody in the world at that time who wasn't Jewish, for the Gentiles who were turning to God. We should not make it difficult for people who have that God dial and that God chip inside their heart to find God. We should not. Don't add any locks or security to the gate. It's Jesus plus nothing equals everything. I have many of you stop me in the hallway. I have people that stop me in supermarkets. We get questions all the time. Why do you as a church at CRB, why do you do insert the question here. Why does the church care about this? Why is the church changing this? Why is the church, whatever the question is. And this is just sort of for all of us. Anything we do as a church is simply about this. As a church, we cannot make it difficult for people in our community to find God. And it's our job as a church to clear every obstacle that people in the greater Rancho Bernardo community would have to God, to clear that away. When we talk about Serve Fair, and we talk about all these different areas where there's little sheep, there's big sheep, there's wounded sheep in our community, that we want to gain access to God. When you sign up, you join us in mission in making sure that it is simple and easy for people in our community to gain access to God. Because many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell the story of how from a very early age, you had a spiritual impulse, but somewhere along the way, the God dial got turned off because you found it difficult to gain access to God. And everything we do as a church, we'll sit in meetings. Do we add a fifth service? Do we, do a campus here? What is sort of the, where is all this sort of going? And at the end of the day, what we always come back to, the filter for making decisions as a church, we cannot make it difficult for people in our community who want to find God to find God. And not adding a system or a lock, but allowing them to meet the person, Jesus Christ, through which we all gain access to God. And Jesus says it's not just, getting the sheep in. Notice what he says in this next part. I love this. John chapter 10, verse 8. He continues and says, all who have come before me are thieves and robbers. Any other system through which someone has articulated to you of how you find God, he says it's not true. But the sheep have not listened to them. And he says it again, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. I love that word right there, whoever. So who's Christianity for? What is the word? Whoever. Who's the message for? Who is Jesus for? It doesn't matter how dirty of a sheep you have been. Whoever. He says, whoever enters through me, not the system, will be saved. That's another word for eternal life, this ZOE life, this quality to life. They will come in and go out and find pasture. And many of us, you've heard this verse before. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life, this ZOE life, and have it to the full. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And notice what he says, whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. They will come in and go out and find pasture, in and out. What a bizarre thing. Isn't the goal just to get people in? Isn't the whole point just to get more sheep, in the church or in heaven or whatever? And Jesus says, no, the good shepherd knows to find life, this ZOE life, it's in and it's out. What in the world is that about? Your faith needs the structure. It needs the safety of the sheep pen. You need, at a simple level, you need a church body. You need time and proximity to other sheep. And there's a safety to that, and there's a beauty to that, of being inside the sheep pen and being one of the sheep. And your faith and my faith, it needs structure. We all crave that. Your spiritual life, your interior life, you need time around other sheep. It's the reason we talk about small groups as much as we do, because you need proximity to other sheep, and I need proximity to other sheep. But he says it's in and it's out. Your faith doesn't just need the safety and the structure of the church or the body. Your faith needs the wildness and the adventure and the risk of being exposed to the world. It's not just being in a holy huddle as a church and sort of locking the gate and saying, no one else is getting in here, man. No, it's in and it's out. You need the risk, the adventure, and being and exploring the world that we live in, that God has created. It's in and it's out. I don't think I'm blowing the lid on any big information when I say this, but we live in a world where the spiritual landscape is shifting dramatically. You feel this in conversation with family. You feel this in conversation with coworkers, in conversations with friends, where they say things. How many of us have heard this before? I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. You have friends who say, well, I like Jesus, but I don't like the church. this kind of language, often we think there's a spiritual decline, but people are increasingly open to spirituality. Jesus is somewhere often a factor in that, not necessarily the focal point, but people are often curious about Jesus. People are curious about spirituality. Robert Wuthrow, an author and sociologist, wrote a book several years ago called After Heaven, and he talks about the shifting landscape of spirituality in the United States. And essentially what he describes, or what he says, and I think this is true, is that from 1960 and before, spirituality in America was defined as a dwelling, a physical space. If you were Jewish, you had a synagogue. If you're a Christian, you had a church. And you could be a cradle-to-grave member of that particular physical space and dwelling. And there was a safety to that. Some of us, you remember that. You grew up like that. There was a beauty to that. In fact, often there's a longing that Christians have for that to return. There was a safety. There was something powerful and beautiful about the dwelling. In our culture, often that idea gets rejected, the idea of having a church body or being in sort of it's often kind of viewed as a country club. I don't want that. People don't talk about the spiritual dwelling. People talk about the spiritual journey that they're on. How many of us, you have friends who talk through this or say this? I'm on a spiritual journey. It's not a bad thing at all. But there's a rejection that often comes of the dwelling, and it just becomes about this spiritual journey. Well, I'm searching, I'm looking. I feel like I have a purpose that's greater. I'm not quite sure. And often when you have those conversations, somewhere in your heart is this sense, if you just stay on a spiritual journey, you are in danger of just being a lost sheep. It can't just be sort of this searching and I'm on a journey. That's fine and good. That's a beautiful place to be. That's a beautiful longing to have. But Jesus says it's both. You need the dwelling and you need the journey. It's in and it's out. You need both. That there's something powerful about both that are at work. And the good shepherd knows you need in and out. If you're on a spiritual journey and searching or looking, or you're a Christian and you would say, I'm sort of on a spiritual journey, asking questions about Jesus and my faith, that's a beautiful thing. But having a dwelling and having an inn, having a church body in proximity to other sheep, it doesn't diminish your spiritual journey, it actually enhances it. Many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell the story of the time in your life where you hit a crisis. It could have been financial, it could have been personal, it could have been in your marriage, and it was in the proximity of other sheep where you began to hear and lean into the shepherd's voice. And had you just been out on a spiritual journey, you would have just been a lost and scared sheep. You need the out, but you need the in. And Jesus says it's in and it's out. The shepherd knows you need both. If the sheep just stay in the pen, what happens? You just have some dead sheep. Jesus has essentially come to say, I'm not the kind of gate that puts some barbed wire up and locks everyone in and says, just stay in a holy huddle in the church. Culture's bad, everything out there is just sort of destructive. No, it's in and it's out. You need the risk, the adventure, the wildness, not just the holy huddle of church, but exploring, wandering. There's something about that that's beautiful, the journey and the dwelling. When you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Christ, you have Christ inside of you. You know what that means? It means everywhere you go, you're standing on sacred ground. You're always on holy ground, everywhere you go. Doesn't matter. And this is the reason why some of us in this room, you have stories from days at the beach or trips with family or being at a concert where it felt like that was the most spiritual experience you've ever had, and you weren't in church. Some of us, you've had moments where it feels like, man, when I'm outside of the church, because the way the psalmist describes it is the whole earth is covered in the glory of God, and you're constantly standing in sacred spaces. The whole world, especially if you're a Christian, you're constantly standing. The whole earth is a temple of God's glory and his power and magnificence. And some of us, you have had those moments where it feels like outside of the church, man, that was spiritual. That was a moment where I just felt like, man, that was sacred. There was something powerful because the whole earth declares of the glory of God. And you will find God, and many of us in this room, you have stories like this where you have found God in some very unexpected places. It's in and it's out. I have a friend who, I haven't seen him in a few years, but he was the sound engineer for AC/DC. Do you remember the rock band AC/DC? And he has this cool British accent. I'm not gonna try to imitate it, but I asked him one time, I said, Barry, how did you become a Christian? And he said, believe it or not, I actually got saved on the Highway to Hell tour in the 80s. And I was like, wait a second, God was on the Highway to Hell tour? Yes, there's someone else there who has the light of Christ inside of him, begins to share, and there on the Highway to Hell tour of all places meets. It's in and it's out. Some of us, you have sons or daughters that you hate fighting with them on Sunday morning to get them to church. But they love to go surfing or they love science class. And there's something in being in God's creation, or there's something in discovering how God has put the world together in science that just lights them up. And it's teaching them that it's in and it's out, and helping them see and discover that God's handiwork is everywhere. God's magnificence is everywhere. And there's something spiritual and there's something sacred about being out in science or surfing or whatever it is, that God is at work in those moments as well. It's in and it's out, and they need language for that. They need language for that. But it's not just I'm going to go surfing and that's how I connect with Jesus. No, it's out, it's the spiritual journey, and it's the dwelling. The Good Shepherd knows that we need in and out to have life. Maybe you could say it this way: there's something sacred about in and out. There's something sacred about it, man. There's even a Bible verse on that thing, man. You always wondered why that was there. This is what the sheep eat. This is what the shepherd feeds, man. There's something sacred about in and out. God meets people in and out. The shepherd leads us to life outside. The whole earth declares of the glory of God. And God meets us in. Both are incredibly sacred. Let's pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, this smells so good. I thank you, God, that you're the kind of God who doesn't just keep Christians locked in a sheep pen. You don't just keep us in a holy huddle, God. You invite us into the world to rub shoulders with other sheep. You invite us to find life in all sorts of places because the whole world is yours. And God, I thank you for that. It's powerful. It's so powerful. You're the creator of all things. And I pray today, God, would we hear the shepherd's voice inviting us into the gates? Some of us just need a church family. Just need a church home. If it's not here, it needs to be somewhere else. Proximity to other sheep. Where they can learn, they can watch how other sheep eat. They can watch how other sheep are feeding themselves. And they gain proximity to the shepherd by being in. And I pray that over our church. For somebody who needs in today, would they come through the gate? Would they not come through any other means but the gate of Jesus Christ? God, I pray for somebody today who's been maybe struggling with a teenager about church attendance. Give them language and tools to see how God's everywhere at work in their life. It's in and it's out. God, would we continue to be the kind of church that doesn't make it difficult for people in our community, for people in this room who want to find God, to find God. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.